All right, fellas. Now there's some pretty big boxing news which has been lurking in the shadows for the last couple of weeks, and it now seems to be finally almost confirmed, that being the professional return of Manny Pacquiao, almost 4 years since he last boxed professionally, and we are now set to see him return to the ring in a world title fight against the current WBC welterweight belt holder Mario Barrios. And the whole situation is a bit of an odd one because, on one hand, it's exciting to see a legend like Pac-Man back. But on the other hand, it's giving me flashbacks to some of the comeback fights we saw last year that ended up looking more like disasters than triumphs. Although Pacquiao is nowhere near as old as Mike Tyson was during his recent return, there's still a risk that things could go south quickly. But before we dive into exactly why that might be the case, let's lay some context, because Manny Pacquiao is just one of those fighters who is universally loved. He's one of the greatest to ever step inside a boxing ring, an 8-division world champion, and technically the only man in history to hold world titles in 8 separate weight classes, making him the sport's only octuple champion. He's also just a genuinely likable figure, a humble man outside the ring, and an electric warrior inside it. He made his debut all the way back in 1995, and his US debut came in 2001, so he's been at this for a long time. And at age 46 here in 2025, after being retired for most of the decade, it was definitely surprising to hear that he's making a return. While there have been rumors for years about Pacquiao fighting again, none of them ever seemed that serious. He was clearly more focused on politics, including his presidential run in the Philippines along with other ventures, and that seemed to be the end of the story. Pacquiao's last professional fight came in 2021 against Yordenis Ugas for the WBA title, marking his return after a 2-year layoff that followed his split-decision victory over Keith Thurman. The fight went the full 12 rounds, but Ugas came out the clear winner by unanimous decision. And although Pacquiao was still in phenomenal shape for his age and competitive, with a reigning champion, it was obvious that the signs of decline had set in. His speed was not quite the same. His timing and reflexes were off, and his legendary footwork just wasn't there anymore. His legs looked heavy, he wasn't cutting angles, or bouncing in and out like before. Instead, he was coming forward in straight lines, which made him easier to read. His punches lacked variation. The usual traps and setups were gone. And while he still had flashes of that famous hand speed, he didn't look like the same fighter anymore. But given he was 42 years old at the time, it was still a respectable effort, and most people were not surprised when he made retirement official after that fight. Once he called it a day, Pacquiao did what most megastars in boxing do, and dipped into the exhibition scene. His first was a 6-round charity event in South Korea against DKU, a martial artist more known for self-defense demonstrations than real fighting. That one was little more than a glorified sparring match, but the more telling exhibition came in July of last year against Japanese kickboxer DK Anpo, who stepped in as a last-minute replacement after Ryan Garcia fell through. This fight looked far closer to a real contest. And Pacquiao didn't look particularly sharp. He was clearly undersized against the younger, bigger opponent. And while he showed flashes of offense, his defense looked shaky. He was often picked off at range. His reactions to being hit weren't great. And overall, he struggled to close distance effectively, though the fight was officially ruled a draw. Most observers felt Anpo had the better of him. Pacquiao himself admitted he was underprepared for the bout, but even so, the performance raised major questions about whether he could still compete with world-level talent after that. Showing rumors of Pacquiao challenging Mario Barrios for the WBC title seemed to fade away, but as boxing so often reminds us, the sport has a short memory. Less than a year later, Pacquiao is now being lined up to return in a full professional world title fight at 46 years old. And that leads us to the real question: why is this happening? The most obvious answer is that it's a business move. Boxing is a business at the end of the day, and Pacquiao's name still sells. The narrative promoters are going to spin is the fairy tale story. Pacquiao riding off into the sunset with one last world championship. But does he need this fight to cement his legacy? Absolutely not. His legacy is already untouchable, as one of the greatest to ever do it. This fight is happening because it's a good business opportunity for all involved, and they're selling the story of history being made. But when you actually look at the welterweight division, Mario Barrios is clearly the weakest belt holder among the champions, and that's why Pacquiao is targeting him. He was never going to step into the ring with someone like Jaron Ennis. That would be career suicide at this point. Instead, Barrios represents the most beatable target for anyone at 147, And that's why you've got fighters like Conor Ben also chasing him, because it's their best chance at grabbing a world title for Pacquiao. This is likely the same calculation. Barrios has a solid resume, having beaten Ugas Pacquiao's last opponent and putting on a good showing against Abel Ramos on the Paul Tyson undercard. He's a fighter who's willing to go to war and who has youth on his side. The question is whether Pacquiao at 46 can withstand that kind of battle. The Paul Tyson card itself was a disgrace in many ways, but it showed the power of storytelling in boxing, bringing back legends or big names, framing them in a competitive context and selling it as a genuine fight. Even when many fans are skeptical, it's good business, whether it's good for the sport or not. The storyline they'll likely try to sell here is another George Foreman-type comeback. The old warhorse shocking the world and regaining a world title when everyone counted him out. But the reality is we just don't know what version of Pacquiao we're going to get on fight night. He's always had this aura of being superhuman. Always in shape, always capable of a comeback. But in reality, 4 years away from the professional scene and returning against a much younger man for a world title is not a recipe that usually ends well. If Pacquiao is still truly fit and still has the skill set to put up a good fight, then of course it would be incredible to watch. Everyone would love to see that. But the risk is that we end up watching something closer to the Tyson-Paul fight, a spectacle that turns into a painful watch. If Pacquiao looks average and gets stopped badly, the question will immediately become who around him endorsed this, who told him this was a good idea. And if that happens, you'll see all the promoters and advisors distancing themselves, making excuses and saying things like, well, ignore the actual fight. It did great numbers, though, and that's not the kind of ending anyone wants for Pacquiao. If he somehow pulls it off and wins, then sure, it's a fairy tale ending in the moment, but it also creates another problem, because if he's holding a world title in such a lucrative division, then suddenly he's back in the mix with guys like Conor Ben and Ryan Garcia circling, and frankly, that's not a road many fans want to see him go down. One more point that deserves attention here is how the WBC is even allowing this comeback to happen. In this fashion, he's been out for nearly 4 years, and yet he's being granted an immediate world title shot without a tune-up fight, or without earning his ranking back. It's a leapfrog over all the active contenders in the division who are grinding their way toward a shot, and it highlights yet again how politics and money drive the sport at the expense of fairness to the fighters actually putting in the work. That's boxing, though it's always been that way. So, to wrap it up, the question is simple. Do you think this comeback is a good idea at 46? Does Pacquiao still have enough left in the tank to make it competitive? Or will this end up being a painful watch? The sport will spin the narrative however they want. But the truth is this fight carries equal parts excitement and risk, and it could either be a fairy tale send-off or a cautionary tale about legends coming back too late.